Mornings with Ali Clarke
on 891 ABC Adelaide.
Okay, so this year's Australian of the Year, former Chief of Army David Morrison, has come under fire on a few fronts since the announcement was made. Some have said it was the so-called politically correct choice for him to get the gong. Others are balking at a reported $15,000 speaking fee, which he now commands. Rosie Batty, for example, charges a third of that. Jackie Lambie and a few others are also coming for him, claiming he didn't act on abuse claims within the Army while he was top dog. Joining me now is Avril. She's one of Australia's leading experts on gender equality and diversity in the workplace and worked really, really hard with David Morrison after we saw the fantastic speech he made. Good morning, Avril.
Good morning, and thank you for having me on your program.
Can you please explain how you came to work with David Morrison?
Well, about 3 years ago, people may recall that there was a report done by the then Sex Discrimination Commissioner Liz Broderick following the Skype scandal and the Jedi Council scandal. And basically the report said we really need to make the culture more inclusive of women, and there are a number of things we can do around selection, promotion, etc. And at the time, Angus Campbell, who is currently our Chief of Army, was the Deputy Chief of Army, and I'd done some work for him because I've been around defence for about 10 years. And both he and Liz Broderick simultaneously recommended me to David Morrison to be one of the change agents to put in place the recommendations in that report. And I love telling the story about the first time I met him, because when I met him, I was in his office with 3 or 4 other senior brigadiers and generals, and he said, I've heard you're good at this diversity stuff. And I said, yes, I am. And he's a bit taken aback because women normally are supposed to be very gracious and very grateful to be actually recognised. And I've always said we need to be more bold. And he was a bit taken aback, and he smiled, and then he said, I've been told you can help us. And I said, yes, I probably can. And then he said, so will you help us? And I said, only if you listen to me and do exactly as I say. At which time you could hear a pin drop in the room. And he paused, and it was a little bit like the conclusion of that movie Babe, where the farmer looks at Babe the pig and says, you'll do. And he looked at me and he said, you'll do. And, you know, that was the beginning of a very close working relationship and a lot of work that we have done and have continued over the 3 years, and which now continues under the leadership of Angus Campbell.
He became a household name, I mean, obviously well known in defence circles and other smaller areas, but he really became a household name after speaking out about the Skype scandal and the Jedi Council scandal. Look, for those who need to put it back in perspective, he was part of the speech that got so much attention.
I have stated categorically many times that the Army has to be an inclusive organisation in which every soldier, man and woman, is able to reach their full potential and is encouraged to do so. Those who think that it is okay to behave in a way that demeans or exploits their colleagues have no place in this Army. Our service has been engaged in continuous operations since 1999 and in its longest war ever in Afghanistan. On all operations, female soldiers and officers have proven themselves worthy of the best traditions of the Australian Army. They are vital to us maintaining our capability now and into the future. If that does not suit you, then get out.
Avril Henry, who has worked with David Morrison, who we just heard there on issues of gender equality and diversity. Avril, did it surprise you when that speech was put out into the public sphere, it got so much traction?
I think what surprised me was that it got so much traction. But if you consider that roughly there are only about 224 chiefs of army around the world, as opposed to thousands of CEOs, it is most unusual. And in fact, there is no other record of a defence leader coming out and making a statement like that around if you can't work with people of different diverse backgrounds, and in particular this case women, then there's no place for you in this. And I think that's really what caught people's attention, was that a leader in defence would actually come out and publicly say that.
So how much of that was him and how much of that were people behind the scenes, potentially such as yourself, who said, hang on a second, you need to step up now?
Look, I think it was a good combination of both. You know, as many people are aware, Kate McGregor wrote much of that speech. And what I think is important is that he had what I describe as a major aha moment. And he has on many occasions publicly said, yes, I am a white, male, middle-aged Anglo-Saxon man, and I can never fully imagine, much less experience, the issues faced by women. And, you know, I've been on platforms with him where we've done what I call a double act, where he talks about how he came to this point and I talk about how I've helped. You know, he said, I've never experienced discrimination. And in fact, most men have never experienced discrimination in their careers. And very few men expect violence at the hands of a partner. So for him, it was an aha moment. And there is a very genuine sense that something needs to change, you know, which not only was at the time of the speech, but that he has now taken into his private life now that he's retired from the army.
So then, given all that, and as an expert on gender equity, how do you feel about the reports around that he's charging 3 times as much as Rosie Batty to give speeches in his role as Australian of the Year?
Well, I think that's quite interesting because, you know, some may say, you know, it continues the issue we have in Australia with pay inequity. But David Morrison, much like Rosie Batty, would be managed, and I know for a fact that David, because I know him well, is managed by an agent. And he certainly had no idea at the time that he left the army what he should be charging as a speaker. And I work on the speaking circuit as well. And we even had a conversation about that. His agent would have set his fee. And the same with Rosie Batty. And it's a little bit like recruitment, and I'm sure some recruiters will ring in and complain about me saying this. But what often happens is that we attach a lower financial value to women's work, whether it is as a speaker, whether it is as a CEO, whether it is as an executive. And so I don't think that we should be looking at the fact that, you know, he has set this fee, because he wouldn't have set this fee. And I would then be questioning why the person who managed Rosie Batty didn't charge more. Having said that, Rosie Batty came, you know, from I suppose a non-professional background when she came to the Australian of the Year under very, very tragic circumstances. And that may well be why they set the fee the way they did, as opposed to David, who has been in a senior leadership position for many, many years and, you know, is somebody who has spoken publicly right around the world. So that's the only explanation I can give for that. But I do believe the agents should take some responsibility for setting those fees.
If you've just joined us, you're listening to 891 Mornings. We're talking to Avril Henry, one of Australia's leading experts on gender equality and diversity, who's worked intensively with our Australian of the Year, David Morrison. A couple of comments that are coming through, Avril. John wonders why it took David so long to speak up about sexism and gender bias when he'd been in the army for so long. One of our texters, I don't understand why General Campbell has been so highly lauded just because previous leadership had failed and he's actually doing his job. What would you say to that?
Oh, in terms of the first comment, you know, why has it taken so long? I would say that that is the case in many organisations, because obviously I don't just work with the army. I work across other industries, including places like banking and mining. And it's not until somebody is courageous enough, and I'm not talking about Morrison now, I'm talking about the people who came forward. It's not until somebody's courageous enough and actually makes a formal complaint that anything actually gets done. And he could not ignore this any longer as a result of Skype and Jedi Council. And what our listeners have to remember is that unless somebody makes a formal complaint, you can't actually do anything about it, because the person who has been on the receiving end of the harassment or the bullying or the intimidation may not want you to do anything, because often what people fear is retribution, loss of their jobs, exclusion, etc. So I think he had come to a point where he had to do something, and to his credit, he actually did. And in relation to the second one, can you just remind me what the
I don't understand why
comment
General
was?
Campbell has been so highly lauded just because previous leadership had failed for actually doing his job.
I think when we say he was just doing his job, yes, he was doing his job as a leader leading the army, but I think what he did was he publicly came out and said that behaviour is no longer acceptable, but equally importantly was he actually took action against perpetrators. And, you know, for somebody to say in a recent article, a well-known journalist, that the price was that he ruthlessly sacrificed 8 officers on the altar of feminism, I actually find as a woman hugely offensive, because it wasn't because of feminism, it was because of widespread bullying and harassment and sexual harassment that action was taken. If as a leader you do not take action and you just talk about it, nothing happens. And we all know recently about a major bank that has been in the news for inappropriate behaviour, where people said, well, you know, we had policies and we had procedures, yeah, but you actually didn't do anything about it. And if you don't do anything about it, then people continue to behave that way.
Avril, Jackie Lambie and others have accused David Morrison of standing by and ignoring abuse while he was in the army. Is that the man you know him to be?
I would disagree, and, you know, my view is that in the case of Jackie Lambie's comments and even the comments made by journalists in the last 2 weeks in certain publications, they are inaccurate, and I would suggest that they haven't done their homework properly, because to say that he didn't care about abuse, that he didn't care about wounded soldiers returning with both medical and psychological damage is not true. And in fact, there are 4 on-site, in our major barracks, on-site centres that specifically are there for rehabilitating soldiers both physically and mentally in our 3 major combat brigades. So that's all our infantry, all our soldiers, artillery, armed corps are in Darwin, Townsville, Brisbane, and there's one in Sydney. I've actually visited them, and the one in Darwin was recently, just before his retirement from the army, renamed the David Morrison Rehabilitation Centre. He cares deeply about his soldiers, male and female, and he has cared deeply about the welfare, not just physically, but mentally and socially, of the soldiers. And I just think people need to do their homework a little bit better rather than listen to one lone voice or use one example.
Avril, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we do have to leave it there, but we'll be talking to you again in about a month or so, because you've done some very interesting research into Gen Y and cross-generational differences in the workplace. We'll look forward to that.
Thank you very much for having me on your show today.
Thank you. That was Avril Henry, one of Australia's leading experts on gender equality and diversity. And also, just to clarify, no one gets a fee or salary just for being Australian of the Year. They must get these payments from speaking.